The history of military aviation is filled with moments that challenge our understanding of loyalty, survival, and the impossible choices men must make when everything around them crumbles. Today, we'll delve into an extraordinary narrative that unfolded during one of the most turbulent periods in modern history. A story that begins with utter destruction at dawn and ends with complete transformation at dusk. This is the story of a pilot whose life changed radically in just 12 hours. A man who saw his world shattered and had to make decisions that would not only mark his destiny but also challenge everything he believed in. The sun had not yet fully risen that spring morning. The air was cold, cutting, like an invisible blade piercing the lungs of everyone awake at that makeshift airbase. The surrounding fields still held the night's dew, and a low mist covered parts of the runway. It was the kind of morning that promised a quiet, perhaps even boring day, but war has its own plans, and rarely consults those about to become its victims. Our story begins precisely at this moment, when the deceptive peace of dawn is about to be shattered by the roar of engines approaching the horizon. Before we continue, if you enjoy incredible and well-documented stories about extraordinary moments in history, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling us what time you are watching this video. Your participation helps us continue bringing these fascinating narratives to you. Our protagonist was an experienced pilot, with over 200 flight hours logged in his logbook. He had learned to fly at a young age, fascinated by the machines that defied gravity and transformed the sky into a playground of possibilities. He grew up in a modest family, where the dream of flying seemed as distant as the stars he observed every night from his bedroom window. But determination is a powerful force, and he pursued this dream with an intensity that impressed everyone around him. He worked at airfields, cleaning hangars, assisting mechanics, doing any task that brought him closer to those metal birds he so admired. Over time, he managed to save enough for his first flying lessons and discovered he had a natural talent for piloting. His instructors soon realized he wasn't just another student, but someone who seemed born to be in the skies. As political tensions began to rise in Europe, and the dark clouds of war gathered on the horizon, he was already a respected pilot in his community. He had joined a small regional air force, defending his country's skies with the same fervor with which he had pursued his dream of flying. He knew every vibration of his aircraft, every engine sound, every behavior in different weather conditions. It was an extension of himself, that war machine that carried him through the clouds. His aircraft wasn't the most modern, it didn't have the advanced systems that equipped the fighters of the great powers, but it was reliable, and he had learned to extract the maximum possible performance from it. He had painted a small emblem on its fuselage representing his hometown, a way to carry a piece of home with him whenever he took to the skies. That particular morning, he had woken up before the official roll call, as was his custom. He liked to walk around the base while everything was still quiet, personally checking his aircraft, talking to the mechanics on the night shift, making sure everything was in order. It was a ritual that brought him peace, a way to connect with the day ahead. He had inspected the control panels, checked the fuel levels, tested the flight controls. Everything was perfect, as always. His fellow pilots were beginning to wake up, and soon the base would be in full swing. There was a patrol mission scheduled for mid-morning, nothing too risky, just a reconnaissance flight over an area that had been relatively quiet in recent weeks. But war has a cruel ability to turn routine into tragedy in a matter of seconds. While he was having his coffee in the small mess hall at the base, chatting with his comrades about trivial matters, the first sign that something was terribly wrong came in the form of a distant sound, almost imperceptible at first. It was a deep, constant hum that gradually grew in intensity. Some of the more experienced pilots immediately recognized that sound. Bomber engines approaching. Many engines. The alarm sounded only seconds later, but it was already too late. The base was under attack, and the element of surprise was completely on the enemy's side. Chaos ensued instantly. Men ran in all directions, some towards the shelters, others desperately trying to reach their aircraft to take off before they were destroyed on the ground. Our pilot dropped everything and ran towards the runway, his heart pounding violently in his chest, his lungs burning with the effort. He could see his aircraft in the distance, still intact, still waiting for him. If he could reach it, if he could take off in time, perhaps he could make a difference, perhaps he could defend his base, his comrades, his country. But fate, at that moment, had other plans. The first bombs began to fall before he could reach the halfway point. The ground trembled beneath his feet, and enormous columns of earth, fire, and smoke began to rise from the base. The noise was deafening, a cacophony of explosions, twisting metal, and roaring engines in the sky above. He kept running, even as fragments rained down around him, even as the shockwave from a nearby explosion threw him to the ground. He stood up immediately, ignoring the pain, ignoring a wound on his forehead. His aircraft was right there, just a few more meters, just a few more seconds. And then, right before his eyes, a bomb fell directly onto his aircraft. The explosion was devastating. The machine he knew so well, which had become a part of his own identity, simply ceased to exist. In the blink of an eye, there was only burning wreckage, twisted and unrecognizable metal. Dreams turned to ashes. He fell to his knees, not from the physical force of the explosion, but from the emotional weight of what he had just witnessed. Everything he had worked for, everything that represented his contribution to the defense of his country, had been annihilated in a single moment of uncontrollable violence. The attack lasted only a few minutes, but it left the base completely destroyed. When silence finally returned, broken only by the sounds of crackling fires and collapsing structures, the scene was apocalyptic. Of the 20 aircraft parked at the base, only 3 had managed to take off in time, and of those, only 1 had returned severely damaged. The hangars were nothing but skeletons of twisted metal. The control tower had collapsed in on itself. Craters dotted the runway, rendering it completely unusable. And the men, those who had survived, wandered among the wreckage in a state of shock, trying to process the speed at which their reality had been transformed. Our pilot remained seated among the wreckage of his aircraft for a long time. Others approached him, offered help, tried to take him so his injuries could be treated. But he seemed to be elsewhere, lost in his own thoughts. He had lost not only his aircraft but also many friends in that attack. Faces he had seen just minutes before, sharing laughter and stories, were now absent, swallowed up by the indiscriminate violence of war. The makeshift medical base was overwhelmed, and the wounded who could walk on their own were instructed to treat themselves or help others. He finally stood up, wiped his face with his uniform sleeve, and began to assist in the rescue efforts. The hours that followed were a blur of frantic activity and emotional devastation. They searched for survivors among the rubble, extinguished fires that threatened to spread to still intact structures, and tried to salvage what they could of the equipment and supplies. Communication with Central Command had been established through a portable radio that had survived the attack, and the news was not good. Other bases in the region had also been hit. The enemy was advancing rapidly, and the defending forces were being overwhelmed by numerical and technological superiority. Orders were issued for the survivors to evacuate the base and attempt to reach a regrouping point approximately 50 kilometers away. The evacuation was chaotic and desperate. Some military vehicles were still functional, and they were quickly loaded with wounded and essential equipment. Most of the men, however, would have to make the journey on foot, through territory that was rapidly falling under enemy control. Our pilot had nothing left to carry. His aircraft had been destroyed, his personal belongings consumed by the flames that devastated the barracks. He had only the uniform he was wearing, his boots, and a growing determination that somehow he would keep fighting. He joined a group of soldiers and began the long trek through secondary roads and fields that, they hoped, would keep them away from the main enemy advance routes. The journey was brutal. They walked under the scorching spring sun, without enough water, without adequate food, constantly on alert for the sound of engines that might indicate the approach of enemy forces. They had to take cover several times when aircraft flew overhead, pressing their bodies against the ground, praying not to be detected. Some of the wounded couldn't continue and had to be left behind in villages along the way, in the hope that the locals could take care of them. With each kilometer traveled, the reality of their situation became clearer. They weren't evacuating to regroup and counterattack. They were fleeing a vastly superior force, simply trying to survive another day. It was late afternoon, as the sun began to descend toward the horizon, that everything changed again. The group had stopped to rest near a small forest when they heard the unmistakable sound of approaching military vehicles. There was nowhere to run, no time to hide properly. They braced themselves for what was to come, some keeping their weapons close at hand, others simply resigned. When the vehicles finally appeared on the road, displaying the markings they had learned to fear, it was clear they had been captured. Enemy soldiers jumped from the vehicles, weapons in hand, giving orders in a language many did not fully understand, but whose meaning was unmistakable. They were to surrender. Our pilot looked around at his comrades. They were exhausted, wounded, demoralized. Any resistance would be futile and would only bring more danger. Slowly, he raised his hands above his head, and the others followed his example. They were searched, disarmed, their identification documents confiscated. The enemy soldiers were efficient and professional. There was no unnecessary cruelty, but also no sympathy. They were just men doing their job, just as our pilot had been doing his only a few hours before. They were instructed to climb into the back of one of the trucks, and soon they were being transported to an unknown destination. The truck ride took about an hour, passing through war-torn villages, abandoned fields, and eventually arriving at an airbase that had clearly been recently captured. The original markings were still visible on some structures, but a different flag now flew over what remained of the control tower. They were disembarked and taken to a hangar that had been converted into a temporary processing point for prisoners. There were others there, captured soldiers from different units, all sharing the same expression of defeat and uncertainty about the future. It was there, in that hangar, that our pilot had an encounter that would completely change the course of his life. Among the enemy officers overseeing the processing of the prisoners was an older man, probably in his late 40s, wearing the distinctive uniform of a Luftwaffe squadron commander. This man walked among the prisoners, observing them attentively, occasionally asking questions through an interpreter. When he approached our pilot, he stopped and studied him for a long moment. He noticed the aviator's uniform, the kerosene stains that never completely come out of the clothes of those who work with aircraft, the specific calluses on his hands that come from handling flight controls. Through the interpreter, the German commander asked if he was a pilot. Our protagonist hesitated, knowing that in prisoner-of-war situations, revealing technical expertise can lead to different forms of treatment, not always better. But something in that man's gaze, a kind of mutual understanding that exists between people who share the same passion, led him to answer affirmatively. The commander asked more questions. How much flight time did he have? What type of aircraft had he piloted? What was his specialization? The answers seemed to impress the German officer, who nodded thoughtfully before walking away, saying something to one of his subordinates. What happened next was completely unexpected. Our pilot was separated from the other prisoners and taken to a room where the German commander awaited him, this time with a more fluent interpreter. What was said in that room remained between the two men for many years, but the essence of the conversation can be reconstructed through later accounts. The commander explained that the Luftwaffe was rapidly expanding its operations in the region and desperately needed experienced pilots. He had observed many young German pilots being lost simply because they lacked adequate training or sufficient experience. He made a shocking and morally complex proposition to our protagonist. He could become a regular prisoner of war, sent to a camp where he would spend the rest of the conflict in conditions that, while not brutal, certainly wouldn't be comfortable. Or he could make a different choice. The commander offered him the opportunity to fly again, not as a prisoner forced to work against his own country, but as an instructor training young German pilots in basic flying skills. He wouldn't be forced to participate in combat missions against his own forces. He wouldn't be obliged to attack his own people, but he would teach others to fly, share his technical knowledge, and keep young aviators alive longer by properly preparing them. The proposal left our pilot in a state of complete moral turmoil. On the one hand, accepting would mean, in a way, collaborating with the enemy. On the other, refusing would mean giving up the only thing that gave meaning to his life: flying. The commander didn't press for an immediate answer. He told him to think carefully, to consider all the implications. But he was also brutally honest about the situation. The war wasn't going well for our pilot. The forces he had served were being systematically defeaed. In a matter of weeks, perhaps days, all organized resistance would likely cease. He would spend years in a prisoner-of-war camp, years without flying, years wondering if he would ever return to the skies. During the hours that followed, while kept in a room separate from the other prisoners, our protagonist struggled with himself. He thought of his family, imagining what they would say if they knew of his choice. He thought of his lost comrades, those who had not survived the attack on the base that very morning. He thought of loyalty, duty, honor. But he also thought of life without flying, of the prospect of years stuck on the ground, observing the skies only as a distant dream. He walked to the small window of the room and observed the base's courtyard, where mechanics worked on aircraft, where pilots chatted animatedly, where the life of an air base continued, indifferent to the moral drama unfolding within him. And then he realized something fundamental. His aircraft had been destroyed. His base had been devastated. His forces were in full retreat. The structure he had sworn to fight for no longer existed in any meaningful way. He wouldn't be betraying anyone because there was nothing concrete left to betray. His country still existed, his people still existed, but the war machine he had served was shattered. And the German commander had been clear. He wouldn't attack his own people. He wouldn't participate in offensive missions. He would only be an instructor, a teacher, keeping the art of flying alive in a world that seemed determined to destroy everything. When the commander returned, accompanied by 2 other officers, our pilot had already made his decision. With a hesitant but determined voice, he accepted the offer. The officers seemed pleased, but they also understood the magnitude of what he was doing. Documents were prepared, not a formal military contract, but a kind of agreement that established the exact terms of his new role. He would teach flying techniques, share knowledge about navigation and aircraft control, and help young pilots develop the skills necessary to survive in the skies. In exchange, he would have limited freedom within the base, adequate food, and most importantly, access to aircraft. The sun was already setting when he was taken to the instructor's quarters, a modest but comfortable space, certainly better than the prisoner-of-war camp that would have been his alternative. He received a new uniform, not the full German military uniform, but civilian flight clothes with an insignia identifying him as a contracted civilian instructor. He was introduced to other instructors, some career Germans, others also men from occupied countries who had made similar choices, each carrying their own burden of moral conflict and personal justifications. That night he barely slept. His mind raced incessantly, replaying the events of that impossible day. He had woken up as a military pilot defending his homeland, had seen his aircraft destroyed, had become a prisoner of war, and now, incomprehensibly, he was about to fly again, but wearing clothes that symbolized the other side of the conflict. How was it possible that so many transformations could occur in just 12 hours? How was it possible that his fundamental identity could be so drastically reconfigured in a single day? As the first light of dawn began to filter through the window of his new quarters, he rose and walked to the runway. Mechanics were already at work, preparing training aircraft for the day ahead. A young German pilot, no more than 19, was performing his pre-flight checks on a basic training plane. He observed the young man, noticing the same gestures he himself had learned years before, the same mixture of anxiety and excitement that precedes a flight. The commander who had made the offer appeared beside him, observing the same scene. The German explained that many of those young pilots were sent on combat missions with only 30 or 40 hours of training. It was a waste of young lives, feeding an insatiable war machine with poorly prepared men. He had fought for years to secure more training resources, more time to properly prepare these young men before sending them on dangerous aerial combat missions. But resources were limited, the pressure constant. Every day a pilot spent in training was a day he wasn't on the front lines. The commander looked at our pilot and said something that would be etched in his memory forever. The best way to honor those who had fallen was not through stubborn refusal, but by ensuring that fewer families suffered unnecessary losses in the skies. That afternoon, our protagonist boarded an aircraft for the first time since the destruction of his own the previous morning. It was a German training model, different from the machines he had flown before, but the fundamental principles were the same. Seated in the cockpit, his hands on the controls, the engine roaring to life, he felt a wave of pure emotion. Despite everything that had happened, despite the moral complexity of his situation, despite the guilt he would carry for his choices, he was flying again. The wheels left the ground, and for a moment, nothing else mattered. There was no war, no sides, no moral conflict. There was only him, the machine, and the infinite sky. His first student was assigned the next day. A young German named Friedrich, nervous and eager to impress, but with a natural aptitude for the controls that quickly became apparent. As he taught Friedrich the subtleties of maintaining altitude in crosswinds, as he explained landing techniques in adverse conditions, as he shared the tricks he had learned over hundreds of hours of flying, our pilot found a strange kind of peace. He wasn't fighting, but preserving the art he loved. He wasn't killing, but teaching others how to survive. In the weeks that followed, he trained dozens of young pilots. Some were ideological fanatics, completely dedicated to the cause they fought for, and with them he maintained emotional distance, focusing only on flying techniques. Others were simply frightened young men, forced into a war they hadn't chosen, and with them he developed a different connection, a mutual understanding that they were all pawns in a game much bigger than themselves. He saved lives through his teaching, of that there was no doubt. Pilots who might not have survived their first missions remained safe because he had taught them how to react when an engine failed, how to recover from a spin, how to land with zero visibility. But he also carried the weight of knowing that these same pilots would use the skills he taught them to attack targets, some of which might be in territories he himself had defended. It was a contradiction he would have to live with for the rest of his life. At night, alone in his quarters, he often wondered if he had made the right choice. Had he betrayed his principles? Was the opportunity to fly worth the moral price he was paying? These questions never completely left him. As the months passed, and the war continued its devastating march across the continent, he became a respected figure at the base. Even those who knew his background eventually recognized his skill and dedication to teaching. The commander who had recruited him became something close to a friend, sometimes sharing his own conflicts about the war, his own doubts about the orders he received. They were two men on opposite sides of a conflict, united by a common love of the skies and a shared desire to preserve young lives. There were moments of danger as well. When Allied forces began to intensify their bombing raids on air bases, he once again experienced the terror of being on the ground when bombs fell from the sky. The irony was not lost on him, as he was now on the other side of that experience. He helped put out fires, assisted in the rescue of wounded pilots, and did everything he could during these attacks. In one of these bombing raids, he saved Friedrich, his first student, pulling him from a burning aircraft seconds before the fuel tank exploded. The young German embraced him, visibly moved, expressing deep gratitude, and he felt the complete absurdity of his situation where saving someone's life on the other side of the conflict made him a hero to some and potentially a traitor to others. Eventually, the war began to turn against those he was now teaching. News from the front grew increasingly grim. The air superiority the Luftwaffe had enjoyed at the start of the conflict was being systematically eliminated. The base where he worked began receiving orders to reduce training and send all available pilots to combat missions, regardless of their level of preparedness. He vehemently protested this, arguing that it was extremely dangerous and reckless to send poorly trained young pilots to face experienced pilots on the other side. But his objections were ignored. The war machine was desperate, and desperation has no time for caution or wisdom. He watched many of his students leave for missions from which they would never return. Each loss deeply affected him. He had taught them to fly, had shared with them knowledge that had taken years to acquire, and now they were being prematurely sent into a war of devastating proportions. Friedrich was one of those who left and never returned. The young man he had saved from the flames, who had become a competent pilot under his tutelage, simply vanished on a mission over contested territory. No body was found, no wreckage located. He simply ceased to exist like so many others. When the end finally came, when the invading forces were at the very gates of the base, there was a chaotic evacuation. The commander offered him the chance to leave with the retreating forces, to continue his role as an instructor somewhere else. But he refused. He was tired of running, tired of serving in a war he should never have been involved in from the start. He remained at the base, along with some wounded mechanics and pilots who couldn't be moved. When the Allied troops finally arrived, he surrendered without resistance, showing the documents that explained his unusual status. The interrogation was long and difficult. Intelligence officers tried to determine if he was a collaborator, a forced prisoner, or something in between. He answered all questions honestly, explaining the circumstances of his capture, the offer he had been made, and his decision to accept. Some of the interrogators saw him as a traitor. Others understood the complexity of his situation. In the end, it was determined that he had committed no direct act against his former forces, that he had acted only as a civilian instructor, and that his situation was sufficiently ambiguous not to warrant formal charges of treason. But the formal trial was only part of what he faced. When he returned to his homeland after the war, he discovered that the story of his time with the Luftwaffe had spread. Some saw him as a survivor who had done what he needed to do. Others considered him a traitor who had chosen expediency over loyalty. His family welcomed him, but there was tension in the gatherings, unspoken questions hanging in the air. Friends from before the war didn't know how to act in his presence. He had become a stranger in his own land, someone whose story was too complicated for the simple categories of hero or villain that people preferred to use. He lived the rest of his life in the shadow of that single extraordinary day, the day that began with destruction at dawn and ended with transformation at dusk. He worked civilian jobs, never flew professionally again, although in his later years he managed to take some recreational flights that brought him a melancholic joy. He wrote about his experiences in a diary that remained private for decades, a document that would only be discovered after his death, providing a unique window into the moral complexity of the impossible choices that war forces upon ordinary people. This story confronts us with uncomfortable questions about loyalty, survival, and the choices we make when everything around us crumbles. There are no easy answers, no simple judgments that can be applied to situations of such moral complexity. What do we do when our dreams collide with our obligations? How do we balance the passion that defines our lives with the principles that tell us who we are? Our protagonist lived through these questions in a way that few of us will ever experience, and his answers were imperfect, conflicting, and profoundly human. What is undeniable is that he loved flying with a passion that transcended borders and flags. He taught others to share that passion, and in doing so, saved lives that would otherwise have been wasted through incompetence and haste. He also, indirectly, contributed to the war efforts of those who had destroyed his world. These two truths coexist uncomfortably, and we cannot accept one without acknowledging the other. His story is not one of unequivocal heroism nor of clear betrayal. It is a story about a man trying to find his place in a world that had lost all logic and humanity. Decades after the war ended, in a rare interview with a local historian, he was asked if he regretted his decision on that fateful day. He remained silent for a long time before answering. He said he regretted many things. He mourned every life lost in the war on both sides. He mourned the destruction, the suffering, the brutality he had witnessed. But he did not regret choosing to fly. Those moments in the skies, even amidst the chaos and destruction of war, were the only moments when he felt truly alive, truly himself. And if the only way to preserve that was to make a morally ambiguous choice, then that was the price he had paid. His story remains a testament to the impossibilities that war creates, to the choices that transcend the simple categories of right and wrong. He was neither saint nor sinner, neither hero nor villain. He was simply a man who loved to fly, who found himself in extraordinary circumstances, and who made choices that he had to carry for the rest of his life. In a world that constantly pressures us to judge, to categorize, to simplify complex narratives into straightforward moral lessons, his story asks us to do something more difficult. Simply to understand without judging, to recognize the humanity in imperfect choices, and to accept that sometimes there are no right answers, only human answers. And perhaps that is the most important lesson we can draw from this extraordinary narrative. War does not create heroes and villains. It creates impossible situations where ordinary people are forced to make extraordinary decisions with incomplete information, under extreme pressure, and without the luxury of time to contemplate all the moral implications. Judging these decisions decades later, with all the clarity that temporal distance provides, is easy. Living through them, carrying the weight of their consequences for a lifetime, is infinitely more difficult. May the Lord God have mercy on the souls of those who were forced to make impossible choices in times of darkness. And may we all find the wisdom to understand that humanity is not easily divided into categories of light and darkness, but exists in an infinity of shades of gray, each with its own history, its own struggles, and its own tortuous path toward redemption.